Marty Clapp is a volunteer in our church, but man, very respected in our community. He works with our students very often as a volunteer, and I'm just so grateful as a parent of 2 students that he is sharing his wisdom and his love and his encouragement with our kids. And so he's here today to answer one of the toughest questions people ask. And Marty, it kind of goes like this: can I be a thinking person and look at the facts and the evidence of science in the world, but also be a person of faith? Because it feels like the world says those two aren't compatible. You can't really look at science and be a person of science and also be a person who has faith in God. So can you help us, Marty, with this struggle of science versus faith?
You bet. In fact, I'd like to begin by addressing the issue of faith, because I think it's important to point out that when it comes to our friends who are unbelievers, our friends who are atheists, there are actually many things that they take by faith in order to be an atheist. And the reason I say that is because that many of the things that they believe are things that are back there in the past that we will never have access to. And so they really do have to accept certain things by faith. For example, they believe that the universe either came from nothing, or that the universe came from some form of matter or mass energy that was always there before the Big Bang. They believe that order came out of disorder. In other words, they believe that all the complex, intricate, orderly systems that we see all around us somehow eventually came out of the chaos and the disorder of the Big Bang. They believe that life came from non-living matter. In other words, they believe that life on earth began somewhere back there in the past when non-living matter somehow organized itself into the very first living cell. Of course, the problem with that is that it goes against everything that we know in the sciences. And then next, they have to believe that abstract and non-physical things, in other words, things such as mind, consciousness, the laws of logic, things like information, mathematics, ethics, they believe that all these non-physical things somehow came from a purely material source. And so again, it's just a reminder that there are many things that our atheist friends do take by faith in order to be an atheist. So having said that, that brings us to the sciences. And I think that whenever you're talking about science, it's really worth noting the founding fathers of science. And this would include people like Kepler, Boyle, Faraday, Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur, Leonard Euler, and others. And these were people who were firmly convinced of God's existence. In fact, this is what drove them to do science and to lay the foundation for modern science. In order to do science, there are at least a couple things that are necessary, both of which I would say actually require God. For example, if you're going to do science, you have to operate within the laws of logic. But those laws that govern over reasoning and rationality, those laws themselves are not a physical, material thing. They are immaterial. And they do not change over time. And they are universally true across every culture. In order to do science, you also need a universe that behaves in a very predictable manner in order to make scientific predictions. The reason that we are able to make scientific predictions is because we live in a universe that behaves in a very predictable manner, precisely because it's a created universe, and so it behaves in a very predictable manner. On the other hand, if we just lived in just this random, chance, arbitrary universe, you would never be able to do something like that. When it comes to the facts of science, that is the evidence itself, that evidence, there are a few things we need to keep in mind that I think are really important. To begin with, as creationists, as Christians, we actually have the very same scientific evidence as everybody else. We're looking at the very same planet Earth. We're looking at the very same fossil record. We're looking at the very same geologic layers. We're using the same astronomy, chemistry, physics, biology. So we have the very same facts as everybody else. But facts always require interpretation. And how you interpret those facts is largely dependent upon your worldview, whether you hold a Christian worldview or whether you hold an atheistic worldview. I also think it's important to keep in mind the difference between operational science and historical science, because they're not the same thing. You know, when we hear the word science, when we use the word science, typically what we have in mind is operational science. And this is the kind of science that is repeatable and observable right now in the present as we're observing it. But that's very different from historical science, which deals with unique events in the past that we will never have access to. And so I really do think that that's an important distinction, you see, because when our unbelieving friends say, well, I don't believe in God because I believe in science, I found that it is almost always the case that they are referring to historical science. But again, that's something very, very different, and it's not nearly as precise as the other type of science. As far as scientific evidence for God, there are just so many things that we could discuss. I'll give you two of them. One of them is the fine-tuning of the universe. In other words, scientists tell us at the beginning of the universe, what you might call the Big Bang, that beginning had to be very, very precise. In fact, so precise, they said that when they ran calculations on this a few years ago, they said that if the Big Bang had produced the equivalent of a single grain of sand more atoms, or a single grain of sand less atoms, we wouldn't be here. Just let that sink in for a moment. I think other very powerful evidence for God is the information that we find in DNA. DNA, of course, is that amazing molecule that's tightly coiled up within the nucleus of the cell, and it carries the instructions to build living things. And you might actually think of DNA as a flash drive. So imagine a flash drive that's full of information. If you really think about it, you actually have two things represented there. You have this physical device, this physical storage device, but then you also have this non-physical thing called information. That non-physical information exists separately and independently of that device. In fact, that information existed without that device, and it had to be put into that device. You see what I'm saying? And so in a very similar way, you have this physical molecule called DNA, this physical storage molecule, but that doesn't explain the non-physical information that had to be loaded into that molecule. And everything that we know about information within the field of information science, everything we've learned about information is that information of this type always, and I mean always, requires an intelligent source behind it. So I think that both of these are just profound evidence for the existence of God.
Awesome. Thank you, Marty.